50 odd years ago when I was making these things. No, sorry, 40 odd years ago, not 50 odd years ago. Sgraffito, working through different designs. Why is that not working? Oh, there we go. It's interesting how I think in these days the idea of how you take an image of the work you make, and I think, oh, it's an impromptu way of doing it. I mean, the way I photograph things now has improved dramatically from how I used to do it these days. So again, these are stoneware reduction fired pieces, and this one, when I was working at the Pottery in Nantwich, was the work that I made, 1980, 83. Okay. So this was the showroom. Yeah, it was quite an amazing thing to go from a college environment to then work in a working pottery. And at the time, there were 10 throwers there, producing a range of work that was spread across the board from, mainly domestic pots. And the main avenue for business for that was a party plan process where, if anybody's familiar with that, but you'd have girls and they'd, like the Avon ladies do, and they'd take the pots and they'd take a commission on the pots and sell them on. And unfortunately, that market suddenly collapsed, so the whole thing went bankrupt. And so I was there for about 3 years, and that changed. And then I got. Let's go back to that. You see, it's jumping for some reason more than I want it to. So that was the showroom. So we're going from that to that. And when I left Nantwich, I got redundancy pay and stuff from that, and I then went to have a number of different jobs. I used to work in some potteries in the centre of Stoke-on-Trent, where I'd actually get a job that would be filling kilns, filling moulds, and cataloguing old moulds from one factory in Crown Windsor in the back streets of Longton. And that was a really interesting period. And that time, there was a scheme called the Enterprise Allowance Scheme. And I did about 13 weeks working at Crown Windsor. And then I managed to get onto this Enterprise Allowance Scheme, became self-employed. And that allowed me to then have a small workshop in the centre of Stoke at a very low rent. And I started producing work that I'd learned how to throw. So I was learning how to throw and sitting at a potter's wheel with a measure and a height guide, and then doing it all day, all week for years on end. I started off with what was regarded as the small tall smalls, and then small rounds and things. And then I moved on to being a teapot maker. I'd end up making like 30 teapots in a day, and the whole way your mind works in terms of how you would actually get to that point of being able to make 30 teapots in a day. And it's a real it's a real thing. It isn't just the teapot. It's a teapot body. It's the spout. It's the handle. It's the lid. There's a lot going on in a teapot, so it's a complicated thing. So once I left the pottery, and I went to work in Stoke in these industries and got the Enterprise Allowance Scheme, which allows £40 a week, and that's what you were given to be able to help you to run your first self-employed business. And then I started to make, using the skills I'd learned at the pottery here in Nantwich. And I started trying to, what would I do with what I was doing? And I started to do things like, okay, I like sort of music, and I'd go and do some festivals and try that one out. So I remember going to Glastonbury in 1987, taking the pots that I'd made in Stoke to Glastonbury, had a fantastic time, sold everything, I had a great time. And it's a really interesting way of interacting with people and what you make and trying to decide what it is you want to make. And it's a very difficult thing, when you're making pots, looking around, what is it I'm going to make? What can I sell? What prices am I going to put on these things? It's a complicated stuff. So from this point on, I did have my small business in Stoke for a couple of years, and then one afternoon, a fella poked his head in the door and said, "Oh, I'm Jerry Smith, and I live and work in Bermuda, and I've got a pottery in there. Would you like to come and work for me?" And I'm like, "Whoa." I said, "Yeah, okay." So I, after a few months, closed my little business down in Stoke and headed off to Bermuda. So this is 1988, and when I arrived there, I quickly realised they really didn't know what they were doing. So it took me a little while to get my head around it. I think, and from a business perspective, sorry, I think there's more. This keeps jumping. From a business perspective, the pottery was in an old boat building warehouse, or dockyard, and I don't know if anybody knows Bermuda, on one island, on the one end of the island, and in essence, they'd been working with a consultant from Stoke who'd been sending all the materials over there and some moulds and things like that. And I turned up and sort of realised, well, actually, this needs to be done a slightly different way, and because it's not working, you're losing like $150,000 a year, and they did that over a number of years. And I think the attitude was like, well, look, if there's a problem, we'll just throw money at it and solve it. And I was sitting down with some of the young girls and say, well, come on, we need to start making records of what we're doing here, what we're not doing. You've got no clue what's going on. So to sit down and say, well, how many of these are you making in a day? In a nice way. And, I do 5. I'm like, oh, and there was a bucket full of the broken ones at the side going, well, this isn't working, is it? Come on, I'll sit with you, we'll do one and work it out and try and be kind of mindful and sensitive about how you do it. So, well, you paint your nails and stuff. It's the same sort of thing, really basic stuff. And Bermuda is an interesting place because it's very wealthy. It's a tax haven off the American coastline, and there's no shortage of work, that's for sure. So you'd get a sort of manana attitude. Some days somebody come in and then you wouldn't see him for a week, and that's the way it was. And trying to get a sort of a level of skill, to a point where you've got this dexterity of stuff you need to have to happen was very, very difficult. And I ended up taking on that role of, trying to get people to understand how, you need to think about stuff like this. And, it's an interesting mix of people. It's probably about a 70-30 racial mix between black and white. And a lot of the people we had in the pottery were an African heritage. And I would say that it was an interesting experience for me to be a minority in a country in that sense and feel how that discriminatory process works. And I've never really felt that way in this country. I know it goes on, but not personally. And one of the young girls, I remember going over and telling her how that this needs to happen. Was like I got a note in the next morning saying, please don't mess with my work area. You're a white male expatriate. And I think, oh gosh, that's a tough one to get thrown at you. And we worked it through, but it was an interesting time when I worked there. So there was a ring main system over the top where you'd pour clay into molds. And one of the things, my job description was to help train some of the local people to learn some of the skills that were needed in the pottery. So we had jigger-jolly machines, and so this is a way of how would you do this. And a couple of the young guys, and I was thinking, well, this model of how they're trying to run this business, at the time Dartington was running, it was doing right well for it, so Steve Course was in charge of it down there. I thought, well, it'd be interesting, I'll contact him and see how it's going. And I needed some young trained people to come and work for us because we had a business that couldn't meet the demand. We couldn't make enough stuff, and it's a great position to be in. So I went and got some of the young people that had been trained at Dartington who were very, very good, and I've got a job for you, come and work for us. And I set up that relationship with them at Dartington. Conversely, what happened is I used to then send some people to Dartington to do some training on this sort of semi-automated machine processes there. Right, so this is an overview of the pottery. Overview of the pottery. And this is looking down. You can see the different things we were producing. There was some slip casting, we were making lighthouses, and the other things we were doing were throwing. And, throwing is an efficient production method, especially if you don't do a lot of turning and, like vases or vases, you can make a lot of them in a short time. We'd keep it quite simple, and that then turned the business round. So in the space of about 4 years, we'd got it back to, we reduced the workforce by 3/4 and maintained the income. So, it's pretty obvious what was going on. So I started to do these brush decoration pieces, trying to find a way to get some of the feeling of the island and the colourful flowers and things and see how that worked with the American visitors. And this kind of way of working, this range of pots, went down really, really well and sold fantastically well. Sorry, I don't know why this is jumping so much. Okay. It's jumping around. So the other thing that we used to do, a lot of house signs. Get a lot of Americans coming on holiday and wanting, the name of their home or whatever it would be with some kind of decoration on those. And we had a huge business in shipping those back to America. But that was quite interesting when we ran out of money and couldn't ship them. At one point, because they did end up really having a very difficult time, there was a period when the lights were off, the phones are off, so electricity was off, and it was like, well, what are we going to do now? I said, well, I tell you what, we can open the doors, and there's still tourists coming in, so we can sell what we've got. And little bit by little bit, we managed to get the phone back on, and then the electric back on. And we used to make these amenity cottages, the little square boxes, which is a facsimile of the Bermuda house. And we used to sell them to the hotels, and one of the guys, so we want 5,000 of these things. I'm okay, well, great, we'd love to make them for you, but, we said, well, the price is a bit much. It's like, can you do it? Well, I tell you, yeah, we can do it, but you're going to have to pay us up front. And we got a $15,000 check, so great. Went and put the electricity back on and started the business again. We never ended up making the cottages at that price. We just ended up saying, sorry, we can't do it at that price, and rework the price. So basically, we got the business back on track, and from that point on, it blossomed. In between doing the production stuff, I mean, I've always been, as I've explained, making things in clay, and my ideas of wanting to do things, from all sorts of perspectives, extremely eclectic. It isn't a straight line. So while I was there, I started to mess with some raku. Again, I was throwing pieces and just cutting them and squeezing them and putting them together. And, just working with a different way of working, because I ended up being a numbers cruncher there, which really wasn't what I wanted to do with my life, but it was necessary to make that business work. So I did these things, it's jumping more. So yeah, again, as I started looking at Easter Island things, I've always enjoyed this kind of, the role of, as I see myself, as a maker of objects that, spans the millennium of people making objects, whether it's necessarily from clay or any other material. And, so to me, that is a really important part of who I am and what I do, is that sort of taproot of touching the kind of, the objects that have been made all out over the world. And to me, there's an imbibed energy of some of these objects that I'm really, really drawn to. So in some of my current work and these pieces, you can see that there is still a connection. These are pretty old pieces. I mean, there's like, 30, 40 years old, some of them for me. And it's interesting going over these old images I haven't looked at for a long time. So there were some benefits to being in Bermuda. So I often get asked, like, what are your inspirations? Why do you do what you do? And, it can't be anything other than the story of my life. It's the conversations I've had. It's the places I've visited, and all those things. So this aspect of being in this country and being able to swim in an absolute crystal clear sea and look at the sea life and all that stuff was an absolute treasure. I took up a lot of diving, scuba diving, which is, again, a wonderful thing. So this is my view of out the back of the house, where I lived. During the quiet periods in Bermuda, there was an off-season, January through to maybe March, where, there wasn't a big tourism business. It was a time to build up stock and get on with those things. But there's also a period where I think, well, look, I'd like to go and travel. So I headed off to India in the pool in that quiet period and really enjoyed the travel. So again, we're back into sort of what influences you, why do you do what you do, and what is it about, the journey, I suppose, of your life that. Sorry about this. So yeah, this is back to Port. It's a potter's village. I mean, literally everybody in the village makes pots, and it was wonderful to see this and experience this. And this is 1990 when I went over here. And again, tourism up there is very different now. But when I was there, it was really lovely. And I'm not quite sure why this isn't popping along. Oh, that's it. Sorry, it seems to jump when I press it. I don't know what it is. So this is a momentum wheel. I don't know if anybody's seen a momentum wheel and how that works, but in essence, it's a big disc. And it's on a spindle, and you have to put a stick in it and stand there and spin it like this. Get the momentum to go, and then you squat down, and you have to throw like this. You have to put pressure up and down in a kind of horizontal and a vertical way. If you put horizontal pressure on it, it just goes out of kilter. So it took me a while to get my head around how to do it, but it was a really nice experience having the village sit around watching me making a pot. When I was in Canada, and I'll get to that in a little bit, I used this image on one of my promotional stuff, where I sort of called the business spirit of the wheel. I just thought it was a lovely image and a lovely connection between that. So these are the things these guys are making. Oh, these are like almost tourism things, but they're all thrown. The elements of the legs and stuff are all thrown in a very rough clay. The way they were firing was just chuck hay and straw on top of them and fire them. Quite amazing, really. This really is jumping around a lot. Oh, yeah. And again, for me, other aspects of crafts are the cultures, of the way people think, the why of things. Why do you do that? What is it about that you find interesting? And delving into asking those questions. Yeah, troubling, images sometimes when you're traveling, and they stay with you. So again, you've got moments in our life when, you think back on what it is, what it was, that
the points in your life, childbirth or sunrise on the Himalayas or scuba diving 100 feet, those things. So seeing images like this were really, really kind of emotional. I mean, the lady has leprosy, and to see that is really, it's not on television. It's there. This person's in front of you watching that stuff. Again, back to my interest in archaeology and moving through the processes of looking at the timeline of humanity and what we've done. And this is a space called Sarnath, just outside Varanasi. And I'm interested in culture and history and religion and things. So this space here is where the Buddha gave his enlightenment speech after he gained enlightenment. And you can see the gold leaf on one of the pillars. Quite a rural part of India, and you'd get coachloads of tourists coming up, and they'd put gold leaf on the pillar there, and they'd light joss sticks, and then they'd get back on the coach again, and all the young village kids would then come out and grab all the joss sticks, blow them out, and sell them on. It's quite interesting. I do apologise about it. I don't know why it's jumping around. So again, classic archaeology. How could you not be impressed by this building? The acoustics inside it are just absolutely incredible. It's inlaid with semi-precious stone. So again, the craftsmanship process of looking at that, how that works. As a craftsman, looking at other crafts and how, you work, how you think about things that are done. Fascinating. Again, in Bermuda, I used to travel back to the UK quite often. It was cheaper to go through New York, and I get a couple of days in New York. So, we remember those buildings, don't we? And the emotional process of those buildings. This is looking from the Empire State Building down the island to that stuff. So, a really enjoyable experience. Again, hugely emotive process. Myself walking in New York on my own on my way back to the UK. When I went to India, it was going back from India through the UK, and seeing the churches, and then back to Bermuda. And we've all seen these buildings, haven't we? I remember I think it was Jacqueline Poncelet that used to do these. The reflections in the buildings of New York used to inspire what she used to do, and you can't help but look at those images and get some sort of inspiration with its angles and shapes. When you look at pots or sculptures, how the light reflects, what that does to you, how does that feed into the mixture of the work that you do and the person that you're going to become. These are the journeys that I've been on. This is what influences me. Yeah, so I'd moved at this point from Bermuda, and I went to live in Canada. So having done all the production stuff in Bermuda, I was a bit sick of it. I wanted to do something else. So I went back to Raku, doing that stuff. It was an immediate, spontaneous way of working. It really opened me up again, got me out into a different headspace. You're going from a really, really tiny country to a massive country where I used to laugh with people, say, look, I live closer to England than I do to Vancouver at the moment. It's that crazy. So to do these things, I can say there were some images of India coming through the Shiva Lingam on the top of these things. So some areas are glazed, some areas are not glazed. So again, these are thrown, impressed into the clay as using like a cut-out rib at the top to just push that into the clay, which would give me those rolled edges. Again, my production throwing's really coming into its own when I'm doing these things. I can get these things produced really quite efficiently, really quite quickly, and put them out there at a price that was working as a business. So at this point, I had, back to my heads again, I had a business in Canada where I hit the ground running. I took a contract for the Bermuda Pottery to make some of these cottages, which was about 5,000 of these, and I took that to Canada, made 5,000 facsimile Bermuda cottages in Canada, and shipped them all back to Bermuda in banana boxes, which is quite a thing. But at that point, I've had enough of this, and got back into Raku. So I ended up having an agent who was based in Toronto, and he would fax me through orders that I would be shipping Raku coast to coast in Canada, doing about 40 firings, Raku firings a day, which nearly killed me, to be fair. And I just decided quite quickly that it's not, again, something I want to really continue to do. So I started experimenting with some just clay surfaces and thinking about firing things in saggers and not having to be so exposed to the fumes. And I did everything to try and stop that to happen. I had a Zatex approach hood on my head, attached to a bathroom fan on blow. I looked absolutely ridiculous. But I still was coming away feeling unwell. And my actual attitude towards it now, I think it's a lot to do with carbon monoxide. I mean, you've got obviously copper fume and all the rest of it. But when you're sticking your head in and around, not quite combusted organic materials, that's what carbon monoxide comes from. And it binds the oxygen molecules in your body. So, recreationally, raku is great, but it's not something I want to be doing. So here, they're burnished. I'm using some black onyx just in the central area there. So I started to use some semi-precious stones. So is that coming back from those images of looking at the Taj Mahal and thinking about those inlaid precious stones? I started to use some gold leaf as well on pieces. So here you've got gold leaf, you've got garnet, and that's a resist, like a slip resist surface on top of the burnished piece. There's a book out by Robin Hopper, The Ceramic Spectrum. I don't know if anybody knows that book. This image is in that book by Robin Hopper. So that was a nice thing to do. The life for me in Canada was going really, really well at this point. I was getting sort of national acclaim for things I was doing. Again, this is the similar process. So moving out of raku, it's like, no, these are smoke-fired pieces. So again, using resist slip techniques, using size lines and markings on the surfaces, and just basically putting them in sawdust and newspaper and setting fire to them. And again, working with different textures, different interplays without glaze. All right. So back to journeying again. It's just jumping around. This is it. So back to journeying again. This is part of what's coming here. So my interest again in ancient architecture, or archaeology, whatever. I was living in Canada, and I thought, well, I've travelled all. I've never been to Scotland. I love my archaeology, so I thought, well, I'd love to go to Orkney. So I don't know if people again have been to Orkney. It's often referred to as the Egypt of the North, and the layers of history are just extraordinary. And how could it not impress you? How could you not be moved by these interfaces between the land and the sky? Well, that's what I see them as. They're objects in themselves, but we were looking up. We were taking on board this idea that we don't know. There's an unknowable out there, and this concept of the unknown, as far as I'm concerned, has always been and always will be the major motivator for humanity. We're afraid of it. It motivates us to try. There's always a question. We try to find answers to questions we don't know the answer to. It pushes us on. Money's part of the tool, but that concept of the unknown is a huge motivator. So, whether it's science, technology, art, we're always, and when we go back in time, we go back to, sort of the Neolithic periods and things. What were these guys? We're trying to work out, why does the sun come up over there? Why does it set down there? Why has the moon got a cycle of 18 and a half years before it repeats itself? Wow, what an incredible thing that we did in that time scale. This is Orkney. So again, I love the idea that these were cleaved off sedimentary rock faces. So when you put them one side on, they're kind of quite broad and wide, but you stand them the other way, the profile's just incredible. So being motivated by the individual shapes that they make, the voids, the spaces that they don't habitate, and the shadows that they cast. Again, these things, wow, how incredible. The Ring of Brodgar, the light, the quality of light, how it moves over the surfaces, how the textures affect, what you can do. And it's almost like a given surface. It's weathered. It's taken, 5,000 years for this to happen to these pieces. I don't know what they were like when they were first put up, but they're sentinels, they're watchers. I did a series of pieces, they sang the song of 5,000 years. I went into these spaces at midnight, ostensibly with a full moon. There's nobody there, no noise, but it was the loudest noise you could ever want to hear. It was just buzzing. And to me, it was like these things have taken on this energy of all the people that have looked at them through the millennia, and it was a very, very powerful experience. Yeah, so back to working with low-fired pieces. So I said, but I worked with smoke fire, and they don't get particularly hot, 600-700 centigrade possibly. So I then decided I was going to try and just use wood and try and get the heat up and try and use oxides and try and get colours onto the surface. So this is, I suppose, a kind of idea of like pit firing, but it's more barrel firing, using an oil drum, but again, mixing the textures up. I kind of worked out in my head, well, burnishing's a great thing, but it takes ages. So if I just did a quick texture on one area and changed another area and just did some burnishing, so you'll see in some of my work that they're not burnished all over. I've broken up surfaces and created areas for creating different textures. I love doing that, but it also there's a kind of there's a production mentality happening for that stuff. Yeah, and at this point I started thinking about, again, you've got the standing stones and how to think about mixing textures up and how to present them and thinking about bases. So, this was a pit-fired piece and a combination of textures on either side of the pieces, which again I think is an interesting way to think about things and how to do that. Come on, oh, here we go. Sorry, it takes a while for the image to come through. And how to change the shape, one side's got a terra sigillata, the other's burnished, and then there's a third texture that joins those two textures together. And to me, I think that is a really interesting thing. And you look at it and think, well, what was it? What did it do? Is it used for anything? And you end up asking yourself all sorts of questions about things. And that, to me, again, is that question, why? These, again, does it have a purpose? What did it do? Why would you do that? What do the spirals mean? If you look on the carvings on Newgrange, Knowth and Douth, there's no images of people, there's no images of animals, it's just these abstract shapes. It was communicating something. We don't know what was being said. I refuse to think it was idle doodling, but we don't know. And that space, for me, the fact you don't know the answer to this stuff is really a wonderful kind of vehicle for the imagination. When you look at it, it takes you on a journey. And a lot of the work that I'm doing now, when people look at it, I kind of want that to happen. I don't want to tell you, it's this or it's that or it's the other. I want people to look at it. I want the work itself to have an interaction with who's looking at it and give this energy to somebody. So it's hopefully taking you on some sort of a journey. I mean, I love it when it reminds me, it's Africa. Well, I'm not going to say it's that, but if that piece is doing that for you, I think it's a successful piece. Yeah, so these points. So I have GERD, which is that's why I'm coughing. I don't have COVID. It's just the way it is after 3 days at a show. I've just got back from Edinburgh. I was up there for a week doing a show during the Fringe, so I'm a bit, so it's been a busy few weeks. I was at one of these mixed craft fairs, and somebody was showing me pieces of wood that were from the Victory, Nelson's flagship, and they were using them in a way where they were working on like wall pieces with them. I saw. And they kind of let me know where they got them from. So there was a place not too far from here, actually, and they'd been given the contract to renovate the boat, and that means replace a lot of the wood and the stuff that had been taken off, some of the ironwork, some of the copper. So you could go and buy chunks of this stuff, the pieces of the Victory, and they'd give you a letter of provenance and stuff. Yes, this was. So I thought, well, I'm making bases, and I got these kind of, it would be really nice to, do a few things with things like that. So I do go around collecting odd things from wherever that have, to me, part of a narrative, a story to tell, that kind of hopefully the work complements that kind of journey. And, that was a series of pieces, again, I did, which I enjoyed doing. Oh, that one's a bit wrongly sized, but we're not going to worry about that. Move on. So again, I'm a bit of a journeyman sort of character. I work with other people and I put my work in other kilns. I like putting them into different atmospheres. I've worked with Nick Collins, put work in 4-day wood firings. I've worked at Wrexham with Wayne Clark, and I've put things in soda fires, salt fires. I put things in Danny Boyle's kiln. When you know the pottage, you can sometimes say, stick it in and see what happens. Using the same materials and seeing how those same materials come out differently in different atmospheres and kilns is absolutely fascinating. And you don't need to have many materials, don't have many glazes, to just one on top of another, under another, over another, different thickness. All of a sudden you put one more texture in the mix, you put another glaze in the mix. You've got so many options of things that could happen. So these are things now, obviously, from more contemporary period of when I was back in the UK. You see the photography's changed a little bit. We've got better at knowing how to work this stuff out. But again, still working with textural realities. So, coming from the areas where sometimes I'd burnish, sometimes I'd texture, I'm starting to work with some glazes. And again, these are soda-fired, thrown pieces cut and pushed around. Sorry if there.
I get asked to give demos, talks and stuff. So this was the Scottish Potters that I got asked to go and do a demo up there. So, you know, in full flow at that moment. And I did some barrel firing with them, trying to show them that different heights of barrels. You don't need to have a 6 foot by 8 foot, 12 foot, 20 foot long pit to get interesting results on clay. You know, if you fire things in, you know, you can get interesting things to happen within really small spaces. You've got to get it hot really quickly. Using hardwood helps you to do that. Softwood splits and it pops and it will break pots. So here I was trying to show them, look, we did a medium and a small one. This is the small one, just to show that how that can happen with some copper and some salt on the surfaces of the pieces. I asked them to bring a piece in. Yeah, this is me building a kiln in Wales, at Wayne Clark. It's a kind of an anagamma. What does that mean? It's a tunnel kiln with some steps in it. So the idea, you just rock up and find a space and just stop plonking bricks on the ground. It's pretty exciting stuff to do, especially when you're not really quite sure if it's going to work. A lot of energy and effort to do that stuff. Yeah, so here we are, you know, putting the slap on the top of it. It's just outside Prestatyn. Yeah, and this is the general idea of how the kiln was packed. Not quite tumble stacking it, but a lot of pots resting on other pots, and you see my sculptures up the side. And the way I pack them in the kiln, I've got shells separating them. So, you know, you think about a big round pot, it takes up a lot of space in the kiln. It really does. My sculptures don't have a big profile. I can fit a heck of a lot in a small space and get interesting things to happen to try and create the flow of flame past them. So, you know, there's a number of things going on. I'm creating sculptural things I like, but I'm also thinking about it in a practical way through the kiln. It's coming back from that production background that I have. Yeah, the great fun of firing a wood kiln for a few days. Beautiful noises. I think it's getting increasingly difficult to do wood firing with the nature of the pollution as such that gets caused. There's also these conversations about wood being kind of, carbon neutral and what have you, and it's renewable and what have you. It's a tough conversation, it is, and there is inevitably almost always a big black billow of smokes coming out of these things, and I don't know. Yeah. Come on. Why are you taking? So yeah, the night shift, the graveyard shift. I fired this kiln on my own overnight in a 50-mile-an-hour gale. It was really entertaining. There was a big oak tree next to it, and I was absolutely convinced it was going to fall on the kiln and everything and me and all the rest of it. But it was like a taking on the elements, and it was such a fight between me and my fears, my anxieties of what was going to happen. But it was an amazing thing to get sunrise and to be there and just go, right, I've done it. And I got the cones down as well on my own, which was a pretty interesting thing to do. Wayne turned up and he was quite literally amazed that I'd managed to do it. It was hard work. Yeah, I love that image. You've got the two with the flash off and then the flash on, and you sort of take on this kind of cyborg kind of facial reality. It's like, wow. A kiln getting pretty hot. And there's always a magic thrill. Going back to my early days, I explained looking in that little kiln when my first pot was in the kiln, to see that first pot and the inspirational reality that gave you. 12:03, the magic, that we all watch these things. Yeah, there we go. That sums it up, really. It was a long night. Yeah, so again, going back to sort of sculptural ideas, and you can see the continuity of the work that was happening in Bermuda, and the kind of, the standing stone, the kind of, Easter Island head, the potential sort of profile, the conversation between the two people. Is that what's going on? I started to use some bases here again. My stonemason friend does them for me. The basalt. So he's a headstone monumental mason. He erises the edges and takes the high polish off. Sorry, question? It's gone off again, has it? Sorry. Oh, there we go. Sorry, I beg your pardon. Yeah, so, I mean, again, there's a continuity between the work that I've done, always has been. I've chopped and changed. I go backwards and forwards. I keep old sketchbooks. I go back over old sketchbooks. I put new ideas with old ideas. I collage it. It's eclectic. There are very few straight lines. It moves around a lot. It always will. It's not going to suddenly stop. I mean, until I can't make for whatever reason.
I think the older you get, the physicality of the processes as well, what you can make, what you're able to make. I've started making some quite big things, kind of almost monumental. A couple of years ago, I was invited to display my sculptures at Glastonbury Festival in the Greenfield. I had a week to prepare for that. I got a week's notice. I was actually at Earth and Fire. So I got home from Earth and Fire Ceramics Fair, unpacked the van, repacked the van, and went to Glastonbury the next day to put these pieces up in the Greenfield. And just a showing of images, of textures, of building up layers, going back to, how I was working with the pit-fired stuff and building those layers up. And you can see that there is a continuity between the pit firing and the gas firing and the wood firing. It's still a live flame. There's still an unpredictability about how things are going to come out the kiln. It keeps me interested. When the kiln opens, I'm really excited because I'm not really quite sure what's going to happen. I think with intuition and practice and experience, you get better at knowing what might happen. But I would hate it if I knew what it looked like when it came out. I want that Christmas Day moment, that wow, or sometimes, oh God, why has that happened? And it does still happen, believe me. I still blow pieces up in a monumental way. I think this was lovely, how these glazes are working, the interaction between the temaku underneath and the shino on the top of it, and how it breaks. A little bit of soda introduced into the kiln, and the salt from the shells acting as a flux on the surface, so you're just getting some delicious effects happening. Is that it? Oh, no. Oh, this is quite funny. A few years ago, a friend of mine called me up and he said, they're filming a BBC series at Gladstone. Would you be interested in being part of it? And it was to do with, I think, the sort of working back in Victorian days and, taking celebrities back to that period and having them work in a pottery for a bit. So it's quite funny. I was on BBC One throwing, I forget who the celebrities were, but, so I got to get dressed up in period costume. I thought that was hilarious. And unfortunately, I think that's about as far as I've got with this stuff. I do apologise about that because it's been a heck of a time. As I say, I've been charging around the country like a blue, really pushing the boat out in the last couple of weeks. This year has been incredibly busy. So what had happened is I had an old computer with all images of lots of things on it. It died, not recently, but it has died. I bought a new computer. All the images I got on the old computer, I realised I've got an old hard drive, external hard drive, I was backed stuff up from. So quite literally, last night I managed to get what you're seeing here off the old hard drive onto this computer. So I actually talked to you today. So it's kind of one of those, really. But what I'm hoping to try and do is, more than anything, is just to try and show my own journey to you, because I think it's quite okay talking and showing people what you're doing contemporary and what's happening now, what I'm doing. You're very welcome to come and look at the display and talk to me more about it. But how do you arrive at where you are? It's about that narrative. It's about that journey. It isn't just about the object you're looking at. It's how did the person arrive at that space. So whenever you're wandering around and you're looking at the work and you're thinking about that, I think it's interesting to have that interaction. And to me, it's shows and I do a lot of them. I used to go into Europe quite a lot, doing shows in the Netherlands and in Germany. Fortunately, that's stopped now. But to me, it's about that camaraderie. It's about that interaction. It's about the humanness of what I do and trying to get that, with someone and enjoy that moment. The objects to me become like reliquaries of experience, the storehouses of emotion for us all. It's like when you listen to a piece of music you haven't heard for a while, and then you hear it. What does it do? It kind of takes you back to where you first heard it, and you remember the part of your life and what was happening at that time. So when an object acquisition is kind of the same thing, because you look at it and you'll remember, and it sits among all the other objects that you've got from your holidays, or was when your first child was born, or whatever it ends up being. And those things again for me are very important, and that connectivity between the maker and the person, and that conversation and how it works. My daughter's here working for us this weekend. She's just done her A-levels. She's got an A star in art, and I'm chuffed to bits about that. But part of that process is I got her to make self-portrait heads. So she made 3, and this weekend I brought them with us, and I thought, well, we will display them, and we will put a price on them. And so, because I sold one on Friday, and I brought her over, and it's a beautiful interaction with the person that bought it. And again, the narrative of that, the journey of that piece for her and for him and me, it's magic for me. It's a really, really important part of what I do and why I do that, and you think back to those very early days where we'd trade jadeite axes or something else for something else. Money wasn't a process. It was just how do you to me, fascinated by how do you incentivize somebody to move a 5-ton rock from the Preseli Hills to Wiltshire? Come on, guys, this will be fun. Oh God, I don't know how you do that stuff. And to me, that's a magic period, an era where, where we're at now with trying to incentivize. Sorry about that. People to do things. Yeah, money is important. Of course it is. We need it to survive. We need to pay our bills. But I'm the sort of person where it doesn't motivate me. I don't get out of bed thinking how much money I'm going to make. I get out of bed thinking, what am I going to do today? How am I going to enjoy that? And then think about how do I then turn that into something I can end up using to pay bills and continue to be the person I want to be. And that's really important. I think when you're beginning to learn about making things and wanting to make things, that as much as learning the techniques, as much as wondering how things are made and all that sort of stuff, of course it's important, but it's also, for me, it's about understanding a lot about yourself and the journey that we've all been on, ourselves individually and collectively, and trying to find a way to get who you are into the work that you're making and make that connection with it. And if you do that, a greater understanding of yourself will lead to a better understanding of the material and ultimately will lead to better work. And that's a very deep held belief in myself that, I can talk to you all day about, technical this, that and the other, but the connection between what you want to make and understanding yourself and why you want to make it and working that stuff out, it's really important. And you will make better work for doing that, I guarantee it. I think I've about taught myself to death, to be honest with you. So I'm very open to asking, to answering any questions you'd like to ask me. And I'm also obviously on my stand this afternoon. If you want to come by and chat a bit more with me about whatever you want, you're most welcome to do that. So there we go. You're most welcome.